Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of a double bill today. I'm with you again in a few hours' time. Anyway, Klaus Barbie, yesterday's subject, was personally responsible for some horrific war crimes. Today's, however, we look at the trial of the IG Farben industrialists, men who, frankly, mostly sat behind desks and worked in factories. Dan Kaszeta joins me to look at this important trial, which sort of finds its place sort of in between the various parameters of how we look at war crimes. So, good afternoon, Dan. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Paul. A pleasure to join you again. It's good to be on again, and I appreciate you taking the time to go a little bit deep in some of the important things that other people might consider to be a little bit niche.
Exactly. I mean, in fact, I'm glad you're here. And as I say, it kind of feels this void between the kind of the dramatic, here is this awful human being who was personally tearing people to shreds, and the other side of it where you're looking at the kind of the wider culpability thing, because these people were in the middle somewhere, that middle section where it's a bit awkward. So but I'll bring the slides up and I'll let you start off, and folks, do fire away with questions, but I think you'll find there's a lot of detail coming in the slides. But over to you, Dan.
Okay, all right. So what you were looking at here on the slide here, this is the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. I'm actually going to talk about several trials because there's a few things that happened towards the end here. There are other things that happened along the way here, but I'm going to talk primarily about the trial of IG Farben executives. Now, this trial happened. This trial happened after the great Nuremberg trials that we talked about. It's one of what they call the subsequent Nuremberg trials. So we're talking August 1947 to July 1948. And they were, I'll explain a little bit what IG Farben is, how we got to this point, and how we get to a bunch of, frankly, gray men in suits in main courtroom in this building here. There I go. I got to learn how to switch my slides here. So everybody knows about the Great International Military Tribunal. When people say the Nuremberg trials, typically they're referring to this one. 24 defendants, some having cheated the final verdict by suicide. These are people like Martin Bormann, Hermann Goering, people like that, the ones who are household names. Rudolf Hess, people like that. This was a quadripartite tribunal with judges from US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. Resulted in some death penalty, some imprisonment, some acquittals. But this was really sort of a tip of an iceberg of many hundreds of trials that happened in a lot of different places. Basically, to make a long story short, the international cooperation on the legal front kind of disintegrated after this main trial. And so the four occupying powers, France, Britain, US, and the Soviet Union, were left to do tribunals in their own sectors. Now, also, there were a series of national trials in places like the Soviet Union, Poland. Germans, once the Germans got a reconstituted legal system, there were trials in Romania, Netherlands. So there were a lot of France, there were a lot of different national level trials. We're going to talk really about two kinds of trials that were going on. One was the 12 what were called the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, because Nuremberg is in the U.S. sector of occupation. So this is a U.S. trial, still theoretically an international trial, but really run by the U.S. There were some British witnesses. There was also some relevant trials in places like Belsen, Dachau, stuff like that. The U.S. had a series of Dachau trials. The British had something called the Curio House trials, which were a series of trials quite early on in their sector in northern Germany. The Curio House being a building in Hamburg. But let's talk about these 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials. Some of them you'll have heard of, some of you may not have heard of. The Milch trial is actually a Luftwaffe general. It's not a trial of milk. These were basically meant to be examples of various parts of the Nazi reign of terror, the Nazi hierarchy, to try to bring justice to for a wide variety, real mixed bag of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and more nebulous crimes like crimes of aggression, conspiracy against the peace, things like that. And so the IG Farben trial is one of three, should we say, corporate trials. The other being the Flick trial. The Flick trial was about the mining industry, and the Krauch trial about the arms industry. Okay, and so there were trials of executives of three of the very large titans of industry. Now, you could very well ask, what about trials for other parts of industry? And largely, they didn't happen. But we'll save that for questions and comments in a little bit here. Now, before anybody asks, I mean, what was IG Farben? IG Farben was the largest company in Europe. Okay, it was a large chemical, pharmaceutical, petrochemical, agricultural chemical, every kind of chemical product conglomerate. And there you see the IG Farben headquarters in Frankfurt. At the time, it still exists. You can go see it. It belongs to a university now. But at the time, it was the largest office building in Europe, as befits the fact that it was the largest company in Europe. But where did IG Farben come from? Well, part of the whole thing here, IG Farben is older than the Nazis, okay? IG Farben was a big thing before the Nazis ever came to power. So it's a little bit problematic to try to sort of blame the size and shape of IG Farben on the Nazi government. And I'll show you what I mean by that. All right. IG Farben was founded in 1925 during the Weimar years, which basically this is the sort of thing that you couldn't do in countries like the US that had antitrust legislation. The chemical industry had long figured out that it could really dominate world markets in a lot of things if they could just get the bits and pieces and parts of the German chemical industry to join up together. All right, and they had studied. Various of these executives had studied things like U.S. oil, the old U.S. trusts before the antitrust legislation came by and busted up monopolies. They wanted a monopoly. So what you see there is the shareholder capital allotments of these 6 companies that became IG Farben. Those 6 companies, some of whom are still household names now, became joined together and joined into IG Farben. No, there's nobody named Farben. Farben means dyes, actually, like color dyes. Partly because that was one of the biggest money spinners, was that synthetic dyes for textiles, for printing, for paint were a huge business, and they were by far the best at it. Now, and that's their logo, the IG. They were the largest company in Europe, largest chemical company in the world. At one point, about 80% of the synthetic dye stuff market. They had a lot of subsidiaries and adventures around the world, including in various countries that ended up at war with them. They had a large, for example, Indian subsidiary. 3 Nobel Prizes among their technical staff. Real pioneers in things like we all talk a big game in sort of the Anglosphere about Alexander Fleming inventing antibiotics, but actually antibiotics were invented by the Germans, and they were sulfa antibiotics. And these predate the penicillin work. Agricultural chemicals and some of the things that became terrible as chemical warfare agents came out of the agricultural chemical business. Photography, AGFA still is a name in photography. This shows how old I am. Back when I learned how to do black and white photograph developing, I developed AGFA film. Polyurethane, which we all are very familiar with, invented by IG Farben, largest office building in the world. 218,000 employees at one point, and that's pre-wartime, pre-use of slave labor. We'll get to slave labor in a little bit here. So that's just a large undertaking, and it's a significant part of the German industrial economy. It's a significant part of the effort. Yeah. I mean, so much so that here you have a painting in 1926 of their board of directors. German company structure at the time had sort of two levels of boards, a supervisory board and a managerial level board. This is the supervisory board, and it's literally called the Council of the Gods. That's how powerful they thought they were. Okay? And so that's a hell of a painting to have and a hell of a name to have on it. This is kind of the pre-war footprint of IG Farben. Notice it does have, things and subsidiaries outside of the outside of Germany, but not a lot of production outside of Germany. But it's a significant employer, part of the rearmament effort. Now, what happens with the war? The war comes along. We can't have World War II TV without World War II. So,
indeed,
we're talking about the aftermath. So, IG Farben is a huge part of the war effort, both before and during the war. So, IG Farben gets bigger, and this will come out in the trials. As you can see there are starting to be little taco chips, in places like France and Poland and Czechoslovakia. Okay, as IG Farben takes over conquered facilities, that it annexes chemical factories and chemical companies from the occupied countries, with, of course, legal authority from Berlin. Berlin will issue a letter saying, "All right, you're now in charge of this company." Okay, so the workforce increases, the number of factories increase, the product lines increase. I got sort of two columns here: the what I would call the normal wartime activities and the bad wartime activities, and there was a lot of commingling thereof. All right. Synthetic fuel and lubricants. It was IG Farben that figured out how to take coal and turn it into some sort of liquid fuel that you could put in the tanks. It was always expensive and energy intensive to do it, and they never quite got to the huge amount of mass production which would have saved the war effort, but they were a long way towards it. Also, synthetic rubber. I mean, rubber at the time came out of plants, and Germany's cut off from places like Malaya and Brazil and stuff like Congo. So synthetic rubber is a thing. Plastic. This is the first war in which you get a lot of things made out of plastic. And also, there's a lot of substitution in the domestic economy. Things that were made out of metal are now made out of plastic. And this company is making 90% of the plastics. IG Farben makes 75% of the solvents. 84% of the explosives and the energetic components that go into ammunition. Okay, fertilizers and pesticides, which are important for keeping the war economy and the military fed. About half of the pharmaceuticals. Again, very important for both domestic economy and war fighting. But on the other side, there is a large effort going into making and stockpiling chemical weapons. Not just the original sort of first generation chemical weapons, mustard gas, phosgene, things like that from the First World War. Huge effort to do that in a number of places, including a big factory in a place called Gendorf. But a huge, large, secret effort to make this new category of chemicals called nerve agents. I'll be happy to come on again to talk about nerve agents. I've done it before. I'll do it again. I'm going to crash this with my book. You really want to...
But by the way, the link to your fantastic book, Toxic, is in the description below, folks. There it is.
Yeah. Shameless.
And thank you very much for all the work you do on social media. Just telling people who think they know what they're talking about that they're talking out their arseholes, because
Yeah, and also there's a substance, a fumigant and pesticide called Zyklon B, which is effectively pellets impregnated with hydrogen cyanide, intended as a fumigating agent for things like ship holds and grain silos. You could put the stuff in lofts of buildings, get rid of moths and infestations, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, as we know now, the Zyklon B gets used for the extermination camps in places like Auschwitz. Okay. Yeah. Now, here's where it gets messy. In that, Zyklon B is not technically an IG Farben product. It's a product of a company called Degesh. Now, Degesh is 47% owned by IG Farben, and so it's already one sort of arm's length removed from IG Farben. And this comes up later on. There are IG Farben people who are complicit with the medical experimentation on prisoners. Okay. again, this is one of those things that happens sort of at ground level. Is fairly arm's length from the hierarchy. We have huge use of slave labor. Okay, we have a lot of both skilled and unskilled labor being funneled into the IG Farben system. So much so that if you were actually a skilled chemical plant worker in some conquered country like, I don't know, Poland, you might survive the war based on your skilled labor because you're going to be in a sort of higher class of confinement than you might be otherwise if you were just a guy that sort of dug ditches for a living. Okay, so even this is a very, very mixed legacy. All right. On top of this, there's a lot of internal corruption, tax evasion, and money laundering. All right, because a lot of these executives at IG Farben are using this war to get rich and to get very rich personally. Okay, now I'm mixed about that because actually, if they're stealing from Adolf Hitler, which they very much were, I've got the Nazis dead to right on. I got some of these Nazi executives at IG Farben dead to rights on tax evasion. You know what? That actually helps the Allied war effort. You know, every fancy suit.
Less money for tanks. Yeah,
exactly. You know, every fancy suit that Otto Ambrose bought, and he bought a lot of suits because I have his dry cleaning receipts because they were found in his waste bin. You know, you'll see Otto Ambrose in a sec, well-dressed war criminal. You know, every one of his suits is probably an anti-tank gun that didn't go to the front. Okay, so where do we put that? Like, you know, we should encourage more corruption and money laundering and tax evasion amongst the industrial efforts of our enemies. Okay, and then we have the sacking and looting of captured industry. All right, so taking on every level, from just appropriating the staff to appropriating the buildings to taking vast stockpiles of needed feedstock chemicals to, you know, taking intellectual property. I mean, sacking and looting and exploitation at every conceivable level. All right, and I should say IG Farben is not the only company doing that. This is happening across industry. So it would be patently unfair to stick that only on IG Farben, because basically every German company did it. Even the German companies that might not have wanted to do it got ordered to do it. So there is that too. There's, like, you know, if it's a tire factory in the Czech Republic, guess what? You know, a German tire company is going to get told to run that company, whether they want to or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a quick question. I don't want to go down a massive rabbit hole, but I think it's worth addressing, and you're the person to ask. Ian is asking, were the same group of companies making poison gas in the First World War, and did anything happen to them after the First World War?
Well, yes, it was largely the same companies. In some cases, the very same factories. There was an effort to try to demilitarize that stuff after the First World War, and some of the stuff got seized. And Germany said, "Oh no, we're not going to make that stuff anymore." Things went dormant for a bit, but it really started to pick up again as Germany started to, well before the rise of the Nazis. Germany started to evade its obligations under the Treaty of Versailles. That's a more complicated issue. I'm not the greatest expert on that. There's a book I can probably recommend on that. Happy to do some research and come back on that someday if you want to go into World War I TV.
We could do that. We could do that. Yeah.
Okay. Here's just an example. This is the nerve agent factory at a place called Dierenfurth. And this is a typical example that anything that was remotely dodgy, like making new secret chemical weapons or using a lot of slave labor, IG Farben engaged in a lot of internal laundering of organizations and paperwork. They would set up front companies. There would be obtuse levels of ownership, you know, joint ventures. They would set up, some were joint ventures with the government itself. There were places where the government owned the land, and the IG Farben owned the factory, but a separate operating company operated it. And every permutation of that, so much so that the paperwork was absolute mess, and it was very, very hard to point out who was actually responsible for what happened on a certain day at a certain factory, because the paper chain behind it was deliberately obtuse. And deliberately obtuse because every single one of those layers of management that got put up on paper had to have directors and boards of directors and minutes. And guess what? If you're a board director, you got to get a salary. Some of these guys had on paper 14 jobs. So there was a lot of guys who worked very hard to make their money from all these extra jobs they were doing. And so this is the Anorgana plant. Anorgana being theoretically a separate company, but very much an IG Farben, operation at heart. And another one, the so-called Buna factory. Now, Buna is what a place called, also known as the Monowitz plant. This is really where the one thing that was really made to stick on IG Farben, because this is built next to Auschwitz. Okay, and it's a factory to make synthetic rubber, and employed both skilled and unskilled prison labor from Auschwitz to do it. Okay, it was close enough to Auschwitz also that the employees here knew what was going on. They couldn't avoid knowing what was going on. So, if you go back to the Anorgana plant used slave labor, but not in the thousands, used sort of hundreds at a time. Tended to be Poles, not Jews. Is well away from any sort of extermination thing. Yeah, prisoners were brought in, but prisoners were brought into every operation in Germany. So Anorgana sort of escapes the chop as far as getting really badly prosecuted. The Buna plant, no. This is what gets them in trouble. So what do you get? You get the IG Farben trials. And these are actual photographs of the trials. So you get these nice gray men in suits, and you'll see what I mean, because I'll show you photos of all but one of the gray men. All right. We've got 24 defendants originally here, who are a cross-section of middle and upper management of the relevant parts of IG Farben. Okay. One of them, Max Brueggemann, he's a bit of a mystery to me. He doesn't end up being tried, so-called for medical reasons. I don't know very much about him. He's barely mentioned in any of the records at all, so he fell off. But I'm not going to go in any great detail about these guys, other than the fact that there's two names in particular I'm going to point out. This guy, Krauch, Dr. Karl Krauch. He was effectively the head of IG Farben through all this. And now you can actually go to if you really want to know what everybody's actual job was, there's not a bad table on the you go to the IG Farben Trial Wikipedia page. This has a trial. It links to not bad biographies of all these guys. Mm-hmm. The other guy I want to mention, this guy here, sort of Otto Ambros, top right, go in one. He was one of the busiest guys in that he had the most of these fake jobs and did an awful lot of money laundering and evasion. But he was the industrialist who ran the nerve agent program and the synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz. So he was one of the key utilizers of convict labor. I should say that there were very few bits and pieces of IG Farben that didn't use some degree of slave labor, prison labor. There's more of these guys. And this is the last one. I don't have Max Brueggemann's photo. He was the guy that fell out because of medical things. Now there was a 60-page indictment. Okay, 60 pages of an indictment, which boiled down to 4 main charges. One is planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of wars of aggression and invasions of other countries. In which case the prosecutors are basically trying to feed a conspiracy theory saying, the Nazis and the industrialists are all in cahoots with each other in this incestuous, weird rush to war. Okay, now and we'll talk quickly later on how well that went down at trial. A more substantive charge here: war crimes and crimes against humanity through the plundering and spoliation of occupied territories. This is basically the seizure and operation of stuff, in the occupied countries, looting, taking the chemical factories, things like that. Okay. The third, this is where we get to this Zyklon B. Zyklon B is not mentioned at the top level of the indictment. It's buried down amongst all this. This is basically yeah, this is the serious charge: war crimes and crimes in humanity through participation in enslavement and deportation to slave labor. And the mistreatment, terrorization, torture, and murder of enslaved persons. The Zyklon B, which kind of could have been called out as a separate thing all on its own, is sort of lumped in with all this. It's like, you guys are using a lot of prisoners and you're mistreating them, and some of them are dying, and you're experimenting on some of them. So this is the serious Nazi shit. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Number one is a hypothetical war crime that is hard to prosecute. Number two is a bog standard war crime of looting and sacking, which has gone on since not right, but it's gone on since the dawn of man. There's a fourth count, and several of them are indicted on membership in a criminal organization, namely the SS. Okay. And there's the fifth charge, which is, the conspiracy to do 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Now, how is this going to work out? Now, if you really want to read the transcripts, they're published out there. They're all in PDF online. If you really have a summer to kill, and you want to do a PhD thesis on the Nuremberg trial of IG Farben, you could read every page of it. There were 87 prosecution witnesses, 102 defense witnesses, and you can see from the chart there, thousands of documents and affidavits submitted. And the trial went on 152 days, not including some sidebar hearings. The transcripts run to 15,000 something pages. Okay? This is a serious, big, heavy thing. Now, unlike the four-party original big Nuremberg tribunal, this is basically an American courthouse transposed into a German courthouse. Okay, you have a prosecution team that are American military officers and civil servants. The lead counsel, Brigadier General Telford Taylor, who was lead counsel for all of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, and so therefore not really the guy running the details of every bit of the case. He's doing the headline stuff. The guy that did the heavy lifting is Josiah Dubois, who was a Treasury Department lawyer. Did not have a serious history as a trial lawyer going into this. And he's facing actually a very serious panel of U.S. judges who are taking their job seriously and want this thing to be airtight from a procedural and legal standpoint. So James Morris on the left, Supreme Court judge from the state Supreme Court in North Dakota. The chief judge there, Curtis Shake, Chief Justice of the state of Indiana Supreme Court. Paul Hebert, a esteemed legal scholar and law professor from Louisiana. And Clarence Merrill, who I don't know that much about him, he was there as effectively the alternate judge. Now, how did this all go at trial? I mean, there's Otto Ambrose in one of his expensive suits. That's probably worth an anti-tank gun there. What do you think, Paul? Is that worth an 88 millimeter, that suit?
Yeah, well, maybe a 75. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. All right. So here's what you get. These are not jumped up village policemen who have been given charge of a town in Lithuania to go kill the Jews. There's plenty of examples of guys like that who are basically unsophisticated war criminals. Yeah.
Who come out of a childhood and adolescence of thuggery and just get made to bullies with uniforms and guns later on in the career. There are hundreds of thousands of guys like that under the Germans across Europe. What we have here is on another end of the spectrum. We have guys who were slick corporate executives before the Nazis ever came to power. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, these guys outsmarted the Nazis in a lot of ways. There were parts of the Nazi hierarchy that really took the socialists and National Socialists seriously, and who wanted to nationalize key industries. Okay, and the Nazis were very bossy about industry, telling industry what to do and where to spend their money, what to work on.
Albert Speer tried to run a unified economy. Actually, that guy Otto Ambros spent a good year arguing with Albert Speer. But anyway, yeah. So you get guys who were slick, okay, and guess who they bring in as their defense? These guys have money. They have by far the best defense lawyers around. They've got their corporate legal team, and IG Farben didn't get to be the biggest company in Europe and the biggest chemical company in the world, and do an awful lot of both legal and illegal tax evasion under the Nazi regime, without having a very sharp legal department. Okay, yeah. And so these guys have got really good lawyers, and they mount a heated, skillful defense. In some ways, they kind of run circles around the American prosecutors. All right, and it kind of shows. The verdicts are, and we'll talk about the verdicts shortly here. The verdicts are softer than you might imagine. Okay, nobody gets hung in this trial. Mm-hmm. Nobody gets a sentence longer than 8 years in prison, which seems pretty light. And
and they take off what they've already served waiting.
Yeah,
don't they?
Yeah. Some of these guys have already been banged up in detention. Some of them are basically out on bail, because of medical reasons. But most of them have been in detention for some length of time. Otto Ambros, if you want to, the hunt for Otto Ambros was a good one. He was a hard one to catch. The chapter 3 of this fine book, Toxic, mm-hmm. talks about the hunt for Otto Ambros, and I argue is probably the nastiest of the lot here. But these guys kind of get off. Some of them get off completely. And I'm going to, in fact, tell you what, I'm going to go forward and then go back. I'm going to show it. First of all, the war of aggression doesn't get any play with the judges. Yep. Okay. Even at the very big, this was a charge at the very big trial, the 24 top Nazis. If they couldn't stick this on Martin Bormann, okay, they're not going to stick it on a bunch of IG Farben executives saying, "Listen, we're doing what the government is telling us to do. If you think we're responsible for foreign policy, you're nuts." Now, the war crimes, basically the looting and sacking charge gets upheld. And the war crimes against, the slave labor charge gets upheld. The membership in the SS thing for the 3 defendants gets lost in the plot, I think. Considered relatively a minor charge. I don't even know what happened to that. I think they made an argument saying, well, they just gave us this rank anyway. It wasn't up to me. And the conspiracy to do 1, 2, and 3 fell aside too, because actually, conspiracy charges are really hard to prove. Okay, particularly in U.S. jurisprudence, you got to really show both an existence of a conspiracy and overt acts and furtherance of the conspiracy, and so that kind of fell aside. So what you get is these 9 people get charges, are convicted of the sacking of the chemical industry in Poland and Czechoslovakia, Norway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and this lot gets charged with it gets guilty of the slave labor. Okay, including my very well dressed guy Otto Ambros. All right, and the rest get off. Okay. The sentences, okay, range from 8 years for Otto Ambros, instead of the guy Durfeld, 8 years, down to relatively low-level guys. Some of these guys could have easily got off completely. Their sin was effectively having been caught in the American sector. Okay. And the 2 with asterisks basically walked at the end of the trial because they'd already served that kind of time in detention. Now, I'm going to go back and sort of explain why this happened. The U.S. judges are being actually very fair and wanting the prosecutors to actually make the case beyond a reasonable doubt, as if it were a U.S. jury trial. Okay? The judges are actually constitutionally, I say that small c constitutionally, uncomfortable with victor's justice and trying people for breaking laws that didn't actually exist at the time. And so this leaves the standard of proof a bit subjective. All right, if what these guys were doing wasn't against German law, how do we prove them guilty? Okay, and actually the indictment was an overreach. Okay, a huge amount of effort on the case was put into that charge one to try to prove that these guys were part of some sort of German industrial conspiracy, and this didn't really happen. And these charges didn't stick. Dubois should have known better, because those charges didn't stick in the big trial. These charges didn't really stick in the Krauch trial. They didn't stick in the Flick trial. But the first half of the trial was almost like a U.S. money laundering or tax evasion trial, with huge amounts of documents, extensive diagrams, charts, trying to reconstruct who was at what meeting, and trying to find, documents that were in minutes of certain meetings, and even the judges whose job it is to be interested were just starting to glaze over on that stuff. And he wasted a good month before even getting to the looting and sacking and slave labor stuff. Okay, now I think Dubois was not actually up to the job. He wrote a very, very self-congratulatory and slightly whingy, if interesting book called The Devil's Chemists. Out of print, but you can find it in a handful of libraries. It's in the British Library. He grinds his axe a bit in that book, but if his legal case was anything like the way he wrote the book, he was whinging a lot, saying, "Oh, look at the bad men," but not actually trying to nail it down very well. Now, that's just my reading of this stuff a long time afterwards. My Monday morning quarterbacking. Very, very good defense attorneys barraged the court with witnesses, documents, affidavits that, if not necessarily exculpatory, were just enough to insinuate reasonable doubt in a lot of different things. Also, the obtuse and deliberately convoluted, structures and flows of money and diffusion of authority, the very weird org charts that were done on purpose that way to keep the executives out of trouble, kind of did their job. Okay, a lot of that stuff was really meant to be a circuit breaker to insulate the higher ups from repercussions if it all went bad. And if you're sitting in a dock in Nuremberg afterwards, it means it went really bad. But a lot of that stuff kind of did its job. Okay. Yeah. And there were also two really strong emotional arguments that the judges basically bought into. The judges officially bought into basically defense of necessity, in that, well, the Nazis made us do it, and if we didn't do it, somebody else was going to do it, and if we didn't do it, the Nazis were going to punish us, And here are our defense witnesses, who are very sort of Gestapo witnesses, some of whom are already in jail, but subpoenaed as defense witnesses, saying, "Oh yeah, if they didn't do what we were saying, we were just going to arrest them and hang them." So this defense of necessity holds a lot of sway with the judge, saying, what do you expect these guys to do as sort of defense? And then there's an unofficial defense, which really was what finally shot the first charge, the preparation of war of aggression. There was a lot of, we don't want to lose a war against the communists. There's a lot. So every time that they could bring up something bad about the Soviets or the communists, they did. And this is at a point where just at this time, this is just where McCarthyism and the Cold War gang. So they're playing to American judges and American lawyers who are inherently anti-communist themselves. Okay, so that gets a little bit of traction. So much so that actually Du Bois comes a little bit afoul of McCarthyism. Later on after this trial is done, he's accused of being a communist stooge himself. Absolutely not true, but he's one of the people that sort of the McCarthyites try to smear. Yeah, and so you get through this whole thing, and you get to these sentences that are, where it really stuck. And what really got anybody was, you got relatively light sentences for the sacking and looting. The guys that got the real sentences were the guys who could get stuck with the Buna plant at Auschwitz. That's the one where the judges really said, okay, there's a lot of culpability here, because this isn't just you running a plant and the German government saying, okay, here, take some slave labor. This is IG Farben saying, we're going to build the plant here because of the access to the free labor. That was the key thing. And documents to that is what got these guys that far, Yeah. And so this is not a happy verdict. It's a happy verdict for German industry. Most of these guys go back out to do other things in industry. Some of them die quite quickly, but
it's a weird thing. But I mean, CEOs get locked up for a couple of years today for a bit of minor tax evasion, and they go straight back in and get employed.
We can
carry on, don't they? I mean, I don't remember any big businessman ever completely losing their careers because of a bit of jail time. Even in this case, when it comes to war crimes, it's just yeah.
Anyway, they get banged up in Landsberg prison in Bavaria, where they basically all get, the ones who are still in 1951 get amnestied anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's partly because of domestic political pressure, because by now it's West Germany. The West German press, is claiming that these guys are basically political prisoners, victor's justice, and there's actually people who say that agree with that. Like, yeah, you're right. They kind of are political prisoners. In the case of several of the ones, in the case of Otto Ambros, I mean, there was a case to hold Otto Ambros, and there was a sort of argument to keep him. One of the reasons why Otto Ambros was let out was because, frankly, he had these chemical warfare secrets. Okay, also, he was the one. And what's happening in 1951? The U.S. is absolutely paranoid of going to war.
Yep.
All right. So. And they got this thing called Operation Paperclip going on, abstracting. Yeah. Now, Otto Ambros isn't, despite some of the things you might read, Otto Ambros didn't go to the U.S. and didn't help in the U.S. chemical warfare program. He was busy with this other thing called thalidomide. That ended up well. Yeah, exactly. So, you can make an argument that Otto Ambros was the second most wicked chemist in history after a guy named Midgley.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so this all comes to a kind of dismal end. And IG Farben itself is broken up, although a holding company exists on paper until well within recent history. But AGFA is still around. Bayer is still around. BASF is still around. So it gets Hoechst is still around. So it got broken back up into its components. The stuff that was in East Germany got nationalized. So, things like that. What I do want to talk about, though, is this is not the only bit of the story. There was another story, the so-called Zyklon B trial, which happened before all of this. Okay, in the British sector, there was this company called Testa and Stabenow. These were the middlemen. Okay. These guys were companies that had the monopoly for distributing Zyklon B and other pesticide products in the eastern third of Germany and what became known as the general government area of Poland. Okay, so these guys were the Zyklon B salesmen. Okay, as I said, Zyklon B was made by a subsidiary of a partially owned subsidiary of IG Farben. At the big trial, the IG Farben guys could rightly point to a bunch of vague documents saying, actually the amount of Zyklon B that was getting sold is at pre-war levels or only slightly higher, and we didn't know what it was being used for, and they kind of got away with it there. These guys, two of these three guys, Tesch and Weinbacher, they knew exactly where the Zyklon B was going. The British tried them in a. Here you go. Here's the case. They basically had, IG Farben had the very, very expensive, sophisticated lawyers. These guys didn't, and these guys hung. Okay. Drosten was basically a guy back in the office who was caught. He was acquitted. There wasn't any evidence implicating him, but the other two very much knew what was going on. Okay. But what this meant was these guys could be used kind of as a scapegoat by the hierarchy in the later trial, saying, well, look, you found the guys that did the bad stuff. We didn't know what was going on. They did. They got their punishment for it. So you could argue that at least somebody somewhere got some punishment for it. Yeah, but in typical fashion, it's the small business that gets shat on by the big business here. But also other things happen. I mean, we have this company Degesch was the subsidiary. What we have is the development of German trials. Okay, all right, and we get it. We have a case where in West Germany, these anti-Nazification trials, some of them were actually harsher on defendants under the reconstituted German legal code than some of the Nuremberg trials were. Partly because they're operating with a clear legal framework, and where they could point to where these guys actually had broken German laws that were in existence at the time. There is a clear framework. So, Gerhard Peters, who was effectively the guy selling the Zyklon B to the two guys that got hanged, he was successfully prosecuted by a German tribunal for accessory to murder and got 5 years. And then there's this lengthy civil suit that's probably worth digging into at some point. The Volheim civil suit. Volheim, he was a survivor of one of the IG Farben slave labor efforts, and brought a civil suit and actually got very far with the civil suit. Not originally, he got a little bit of money out of the original, but on appeal, and this thing dragged on for a very long time. He got a large settlement for a lot of people out of a lot of different bits and pieces of the refuse of IG Farben. So, I mean, part of that is, don't give up at the Wartime trials. Fail. This is sort of this is the O.J. Simpson approach. Clean them out in civil court. So there's something to be said for that, and there was some success there. Now, I think that's the end of my. That's the.
It is. That's the last slide. Yeah, I mean, well.
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff, Dan. I've got questions and comments from myself and from the viewers there. So you talked about the wealth of documentation they brought to the trial there. So they clearly went. The prosecution counsel knew that these people had made the stuff. They knew that they had taken the factories. That's not the question there. It's proving the knowledge, isn't it? In a hypothetical, is that if I went into a DIY store and said, I would like to damage my horrible neighbor's car, and the guy said, what you want is to pour this type of paint stripper over the top of the car there.
Yeah.
That person there could be part of the crime if I then vandalize the car. But if I just go into a DIY store and I buy a paint stripper and I dip it over my neighbor's car, the DIY store is not culpable and not guilty of that. Is that basically the issue here, is making it the knowledge?
Yeah. Because, I mean, as far as actually producing things, IG Farben isn't making anything that's illegal by the standard of the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even the secret chemical weapons stuff they were making, it was legal to make chemical weapons. Every country did it. The very, very poorly and thinly written Geneva Protocol basically just banned first use. It didn't ban making or stockpiling chemical weapons. This is why, in sort of my usual narrower niche of chemical warfare geeks, people are, why did they get in trouble for making nerve agents? Well, because that was completely, utterly legal. They got, the problem with making the nerve agents was they used slave labor in the nerve agent factory. That was the problem.
Yeah.
Okay. And actually, I'm not even sure the nerve agent effort even got mentioned in court, partly because it was quite shrouded in secrecy. And this is at the point at which the U.S. And Britain is working extremely hard to try to with difficulty to try to reverse engineer what had happened in the nerve agent factory. Yeah.
Yeah. We had a comment from just an interesting aside from James. One of the heiresses to the IG Farben fortune was in the news a few weeks ago. Rabidly anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, like great grandfather, like great granddaughter, I suppose.
Yeah,
So,
well, again, I mean, there are. It's not like there was an IG Farben family. This is, there were a lot of people who can claim to be an heiress to the IG Farben fortunes because this is a huge merger of a lot of different things, as opposed to the Krupp family. And one of the Krupps was tried in the original Nuremberg trial and acquitted because effectively they put the wrong Krupp on trial, because by the time they put him on trial, he was a senile, very ill old man who couldn't remember it. Legitimately couldn't remember all the things. And they should have tried his son, and they did try his son, in the subsequent trial. And that Krupp trial didn't go much better than the IG Farben trial, to be honest.
I mean, Kevin asked about, were there people tried who tested the gas, etc., on Jews, Soviets, etc., before it went into full-scale production? But we're now back into that initial thing about the people who are actually responsible for the vicious crimes at the other end of the scale. So
Well, to be honest, the actual gruesome stuff that's being done there is being done by this medical research arm of the SS, not IG Farben. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so there's a circuit breaker there. There are some really wicked, nasty doctors who are experimenting with this stuff, and these doctors hold SS ranks and are getting salary paid by the SS. So yeah, there were people that did that sort of thing, and some of them really got what's coming to them. Others didn't. Some we don't know what happened to them. Some killed themselves, and so that's probably a subject for another broadcast.
I mean, to wind things up, as we're going through this war crimes series, it's going to raise as many questions as we're going to settle questions, because it does raise. We know we're going into this series knowing that less than 10% of the people culpable were ever brought to any form of justice. We know that the whole system was, I guess you'd call it, flawed.
Yeah.
But what does this case that comes? I mean, even when you started off and you said about the fact it's taking place after the big trial of Goering and Bormann, it felt to me a bit. I'm not trivializing the events that are being there. It felt like the third and fourth playoff final after a World Cup. After the big one, to some extent, no one cares. It's less important than the Goering and the Bormann and the big high Nazis. So how does this trial, from your point of view, fit into our greater understanding of the war crimes trials as a big subject?
Okay, it's I mean, the whole thing is a little bit of a mess, because on the IG Farben trial is a useful cross section of this, in that whole issue, in that it highlights a lot of the fundamental contradictions.
Yeah.
That on the one hand, you've got this totalitarian regime that's totally horrific and very mean to people, and kills people that it doesn't do what it wants to do, and kills people that it doesn't like. And then, of course, you're trying to punish people within that regime for saying, well, we're punishing you for doing what the guys who cut people's heads off, told you to do. And their defense is, well, they were going to cut my head off if I didn't do it. So that's a fundamental contradiction.
Yeah.
There is a body of sort of Anglo-American jurisprudence that says, actually ex post facto lawmaking is bad. It's against the U.S. Constitution. We're going to try a guy for an offense that wasn't an offense in law at the time that it happened. That's one of the reasons why none of these guys were taken to the U.S. for trial. Okay. The Soviet Union had no problem taking people to the Soviet Union for trial because it had a different legal tradition. Okay. There was very much this idea that, these guys would have very good grounds for ex post facto defense in the U.S. and jurisdiction issues and all that. And so we have we have the fundamental contradiction of a U.S. court, U.S. judges, no jury, in a courtroom in Nuremberg, in Germany, saying, "All right, we have jurisdiction because we say we have jurisdiction, and yes, we're trying you for things that weren't illegal when you did them." And so that bridles against a lot of American legal thinking. How do you know? And the judges themselves were very uncomfortable with some aspects of that, and so therefore they really did want a ironclad case. And also, I think one of the lessons learned here is, a big, huge trial with lots of defendants and thousands of documents maybe is not as effective as smaller trials, more focused. I mean, that's how the Zyklon B guys got it, and it was a very quick trial. Because
if you charge someone with 10 things, but 5 of them are laughable, it then draws suspicion about the other 5 that remain, isn't it? It's like, well, hang on, that one. Whereas if you say, right, let's go for this one thing that is a slam dunk.
And honestly, they could have leaned harder on Zyklon B and the plant at Auschwitz, and said, all right, you could have made a policy decision saying, the sacking of the chemical plants in Poland and Belgium and wherever was bad, but we're not trying anybody in the tire industry for sacking the tire plant in Czechoslovakia. We're not. So you raised the point of selective prosecution, but on that. So find the worst stuff, and that you have the best evidence, and go deepest on it. It was a broad scattershot indictment against a broad scattershot bunch of people, and it kind of worked a little bit.
But that's essentially, Dan, that's the clunkiness of democracy. Is the democracy and due process, by definition, it isn't perfect. Whereas weirdly, dictatorship and just not and killing someone without a trial is far more effective. And we had Adam Wakeling on 2 days ago from Australia saying the overwhelming Australian public opinion about Japanese war criminals in 1945 was just shoot them. We don't even put them in the dock. Just shoot them. Just that's it. We don't care. So that way of dealing with things is very efficient, but it isn't what we're trying to represent as the victors, as the better people.
I mean, victor's justice will always carry the taint of being victor's justice, even if the other side really is bad. And so I think these trials do sit awkwardly in a lot of places, in a lot of contexts. I don't think there's an easy answer for that. I think you're going to get somebody on here probably smarter than me on the legal issues.
The legal issues. I mean, I think you summed it up very well. Is that it feels awkward. It doesn't feel like the right outcome occurred, so therefore people kind of aren't really interested in it because it feels that somehow it didn't quite do what it was supposed to do. But that's just how it is, I guess. That's
and also honestly, when you're trying to take on IG Farben, another thing that occurs to me, you need to treat it like an organized crime trial in certain ways. You just don't grab everybody, throw them in the dock. You know what? Those 2 guys that hanged early on, they probably would have squealed like pigs to save themselves. All right, they would have sung like canaries and say, all right, we're going to give you 20 years instead of the rope, but cough it all up and testify. And guess what? By the time the big trial comes by, those 2 guys that hanged probably had enough to really help make a case, but they were already dead. Okay, and getting some of the guys lower down to flip and turn state's evidence. This is now very, very common in prosecuting large organized criminal activity, and that just wasn't done in these trials. Okay.
I mean, it seems to me that maybe one of those sort of genius lawyers, like the ones we see in the movies, is that someone says to them, "Look, it doesn't. There are certain crimes these people we know they did, but we're not going to put them on a league table. What we're going to ask you to do is find the bit that we can make stick the most and give the biggest sentence for. It came up in the sidebar, the Al Capone for tax evasion kind of thing, as opposed to Al Capone for mass. So some sort of genius might have looked at all that documentation and say, yeah, forget about this, this sort of aggressive policy about warmongering. It's too vague. This is the thing here. Here's the paper trail that says this. And here's where you said this in this document here. We're going to do you for that.
Yeah. And these prosecutors didn't have the kind of experience.
Yeah.
These were not guys who'd done that sort of work before. And a more mafia style trial, and what you didn't have here is you didn't have anybody grassing out the bosses. Okay.
Yeah.
And that needed to happen. You had a lot of documents, and the documents were vague, or you say, well, I don't remember what was in that document because it was 5 years ago when there was a war on. So, a guy can pretend to not remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a mess, but
I mean, at the end of the day, we can say that due process occurred. They were tried. Some were found guilty, and it wasn't perfect. But as we'll find out in this series, and I said a few minutes ago, 90% of people culpable weren't even brought to trial at all. So we have to sit it somewhere in there. It's not a complete success. It's not a complete failure, but it's interesting to look at as one aspect of this wider series. So we will leave it there, Dan. So as I said, folks, as Dan said, his book is the only one I would go to for anything about toxins and gas and nerve agents, all that stuff. Then follow him on social media, where he's always telling people who are idiots that they're wrong, which is good. I'll be back in a few hours' time. There's your other one. Oh yeah, that's your last appearance, was about the Forest Brotherhood, and we talked about Lithuania and Latvia and the Baltic states. That was fantastic, folks. I'll be back in a couple of hours' time. In the meantime, thank you everybody for your fantastic comments and questions. I'll see you all later on. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, viewers. Until later. Cheers. Bye.